Wow, that was an absolute madness. Now, no intro, no nonsense, let's just get straight into this one. On lap 7 of the Australian Grand Prix, Alex Albon crashed out of the race, initially bringing out the safety car, which then on lap 8 turned into a red flag. On lap 53, we saw K-Mag go into the wall on the exit of turn 3, which took his tyre completely off the rim and leaving it on the track. Initially, there were thoughts that maybe he had a puncture or maybe a suspension failure, but reading his post-race comments, it does seem like he just made a mistake. Even though K-Mag safely stopped his car near an opening in the barrier, after a few laps to survey the situation, on lap 55 the race was then red flagged yet again. And now this meant that we would have yet another grid start, but given that the red flag was thrown out on lap 55 out of 58, by the time the cars came into the pits and then did their formation lap once the session got restarted, all of those count towards the racing laps, which meant that at the restart, we were on lap 57 out of 58. From there, it was bumper cars all the way. Sainz got in a little bit too deep, clipping Alonso and spinning him out. Logan Sargent locked up, crashing into the back of De Vries, taking both of them out of the race. And then finally Gasly also locked up, went off at turn 1 and when rejoining the track, collided with his teammate, taking both of them out of the race. Sacre bleu. This threw out a third red flag, which is a record for Formula 1, but it still meant that even once all of the cars came back into the pits, we still had one remaining lap, lap 58, that still needed to be finished. There was a lot of confusion about what the order would be for the final restart, but because the cars didn't reach the end of Sector 1 before the red flag was shown, officially the only point of reference that the stewards had to get a starting grid was the order of the previous restart before the crash, so the grid was set on countback. This meant that regardless of who was where after the crashes, they would go back to where they were, and if any of the cars that were ahead of them had crashed out and wouldn't be able to continue, so that was Gasly, Ocon, De Vries and Sargent, that would mean that you would move up into their place on the grid. Even though we had just one lap left, officially the race still needed to be completed, so the cars headed out under safety car with no overtaking as they needed to. Then the safety car peeled into the pits right at the end, and Max crossed the line to win and complete the full 58 laps. So let's get into the big topics and just my thoughts in general. Now, on the red flags, this is something where the stewards have more information than any of us do. They have all of the cameras, they have the feedback from the teams and the drivers, and they also have access and lines of communication to the marshals on the ground, who are also the ones that actually have to risk their lives in some way to clear the incident. As far as the Albon incident, it's not as if they were massively trigger happy to throw out a red flag as soon as they saw the crash. It actually took them a while to show the red because I presume that they spoke to the marshals on the ground, assessed the situation, and then decided that it would be safer to solve the incident under a red, despite the effect that it would have on the flow of the Grand Prix. For the K-Mag incident, even though it was just debris, I do still think that it's worth noting that because the actual rim was damaged, that is not just carbon fiber and rubber on the track, that is also pieces of metal on the track as well, and whilst the red flag might seem like overkill, there wasn't even universal agreement between the drivers. Lewis on the track reported that there was loads of debris, hinting that it was still very dangerous even then, whilst after the fact both Max and Fernando were shocked that a red flag was brought out. There's no doubt that in the past, just a safety car would usually cover the situation where there's debris on the track, and for the Albon incident, usually a recovery vehicle would be used to lift the car away, whilst the safety car would slow the pack completely down to a safe speed whilst they were going past the incident. But even as we saw from Suzuka last year, there is no one solution for the hundreds of variables that could be at play during each different incident. The weather, debris, barrier damage, how many cars are involved, and many more. I think for the Albon incident, I understand the need for a red flag when you've got a car in the barriers and then stranded on the circuit in need of a recovery vehicle. As far as the K-Mag incident, yes, it's more borderline because a safety car could have just done the job, but Because of how late it happened, the FIA knew that it would also mean that the race would finish under the safety car, and so they made the choice to give the drivers and also fans a racing finish to the checkered flag. When it comes to the debate about ending races either under a safety car or not, I'm actually going to defend the FIA by saying that they're literally in a lose-lose situation, whatever they decide. In 2022 at Monza, when Ricciardo broke down with 6 laps to go, no red flag was brought out, just the safety car, and by the time the marshals had recovered the car, we ran out of laps to get a green flag, which meant that the race did finish under a safety car, and fans were raging. Now in Australia in 2023, when K-Mag crashed out with 5 laps to go, this time the FIA did put out a red flag so that we would get green flag racing, but then this led to more incidents at the restart, more confusion, no racing at the checkered flag, and guess what? Fans raging yet again. It was actually talked about after the race that after Monza last year, the teams did have a conversation with the FIA and kind of told them that as a priority they would prefer to end races under green flag conditions. Now, that does not mean that this is an actual rule. This is something that the FIA can make a conscious choice to go either one way or the other. But the FIA took on the feedback from the teams, and that is why we got the late red flag today, which allowed us the opportunity of a grid start and green flag to the finish. I think the frustration for me, and this is where I actually want to know your opinion in the comments, what do you want? Because you can blame the FIA as much as you want, but ultimately, the FIA can't stop drivers from being absolute bozos and forgetting where their brake pedal is at restarts. In any case, a standing start is going to bring unpredictability and a higher chance of incidents. It's as simple as that. Some people have mentioned that the solution under a red flag restart should be like a regular rolling safety car restart, but if everyone is on brand new tires and there's only a few laps to go, I feel like that would just be a train to the finish for 2 or 3 laps because everyone's pace would be fairly similar on brand new tires and with no DRS. I actually think that if the drivers and teams told the FIA after Monza that they would prefer to finish under green flag racing, then honestly what the FIA did was totally fine and within their rights. Because these red flag restarts are still quite new to Formula 1, that's what then led to the confusion about the grid order as well. But again, although it took a while because this situation is so new, to take the grid on countback was also the right thing to do. I said on Twitter after the race that making the right decision slowly is better than making the wrong one quickly. Now, look, not to mention Abu Dhabi 2021 and a certain Michael Masi, who actually was at the race, ironically, the FIA did follow the rulebook and everything they did was within their rights to do so. To be honest, my biggest frustration going away from this race is actually with the drivers. On that last restart, they were an embarrassment, especially Sainz, Gasly, Sargent and Stroll. I find it hilarious that going into this weekend, the drivers were like, yeah, 3 practice sessions is way too long, we don't need that. But then under the pressure of a restart, when apparently they've had all of the practice that they needed, we had multiple drivers locking up, misjudging their braking, misjudging their tyre temps, and actually being the reason why lots of fans were unhappy with the finish. Now, some drivers like Stroll locked up and there wasn't any consequences. But then the other drivers like Gasly, Sainz and Sargent, they caused multiple drivers to end up in the barrier, in the gravel, or facing the wrong way. There was also a bit of debate about the Sainz penalty as well, which to me was absolutely crazy. People, I think, misunderstand what it means to take the grid from countback when the drivers don't reach the end of Sector 1 after an incident. It doesn't mean that you can then use that to say that the racing didn't count, and so why would Sainz get a penalty? The racing did count. It quite literally counted as lap 57. And as Jack Aiken pointed out on Twitter, if you're completely at fault for taking a driver out, which Sainz absolutely was, it doesn't matter if it's a racing lap, a lap under the safety car, a lap where later countback was needed, or even if it's the formation or even reconnaissance lap on the way to the grid before the race even starts. If you cause an incident, there's going to be consequences. It's as simple as that. Lap 57 counted. It's just that afterwards a grid order couldn't officially be made as the drivers didn't get to the first point of reference before the red flag came out. Oh, and also, not to keep going on about this, but the driver who had the absolute worst incident that no one is talking about was Logan Sargent. He actually dropped to last on the restart and went into the first corner with more time to think and more time to react than anyone else. And he still locked up and piled into the back of De Vries, taking both of themselves out. What's funny to me is that the biggest mistake, in my opinion, that was made by the FIA was with this incident. If you're going to give Sainz a rightful penalty, then Sargent should absolutely have one as well, with a 3-place grid drop for the next race. Despite this being a bit of a ranty video, this race low-key was actually amazing. It had everything. It had great racing, boring racing, great driving, terrible driving, controversy, incidents, and much, much more. That's usually how it goes with F1, and that's kind of why I love it, but to reiterate my thoughts, I didn't think the FIA actually did too much wrong when it came to the flags and the restarts. If the drivers want for racing to finish under green flag conditions during late race incidents, then they themselves need to do better than what we saw.